Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're jumping right into the next talk of today. We've got Wakanyi Hoffman here. Wakanyi Hoffman is an independent researcher focused on expanding the concept of Ubuntu, the African philosophy of personhood. She's currently writing an introductory book on contemporary Ubuntu principles and ethics. Presently, she's serving as a research fellow at the New Institute in Hamburg, and she's a part of the Conceptions of Human Flourishing program there. She's also a member of a team developing an AI platform for indigenous knowledge collected from various data from different indigenous communities worldwide. Wakanyi Hoffman also holds a master's degree in development, education, and global learning from the University College of London and is a global speaker on Ubuntu consciousness, which she argues is the original conception of human flourishing with African origins and globally dispersed. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that today. The title of her talk is Afri-I, is that correct, versus Gen AI, African intelligence versus generative artificial intelligence, that is, decoding the logic in African Ubuntu mindset to humanize machine learning for culturally inclusive ethics. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I have to apologize, I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I start to cough, if I go into a fit of a cough, don't be awkward about it. We'll just kind of take a break and see how it goes. Thanks so much for that introduction. I don't really need to add any more, except to say that I'm really grateful to be here. I've learned so much. It's like mind-boggling, and my brain is, last night at dinner, I could barely sing. I left early with my little bag because it was just all too much to take in, including the fact that I'm slightly jet-lagged. So I'll begin with a little story about myself and why the work that I do is important to me personally. I was raised in a forest on the outskirts of Nairobi City, at the foot of the Ngong Hills. And I've got a friend here who actually grew up in Ngong. This is like divinely intervened. So Ngong Hills is where she's from, and I grew up at the foot of the Ngong Hills. Has anybody here ever watched the film Out of Africa? Out of Africa, anyone? Meryl Streep, she begins with, I had a farm in Africa, I had a farm in Africa at the foot of the Ngong Hills. So my house is just a stone's throw away from where she speaks. So that is my little Hollywood fame. I wasn't in the film. Some friends of mine were, though. So my childhood was really wondrous and joyful in many ways, and also unique in many ways also. I was the youngest of 5 children, and therefore I kind of grew up as like an only child. And it was an isolated, lonely childhood, but I never really felt alone because I spent most of my time in the forest. My school was actually inside the Ngong Forest. So it's a little primary school, public school called the Ngong Road Forest Primary School. And it's still there, really run down. But at the time growing up, I didn't think of it as anything. It's just what we had. And so I grew up in that, walked to school every day. So really unique in many ways, but I didn't realize that it was a unique childhood experience. I just assumed, as we all do, that this is what everyone else is experiencing. But I actually grew up in a forest. So I spent most of my time exploring all the creatures and flora and fauna. And to me, everything that was living there was part of all my relations, right? So I never really thought of trees and plants and the monkeys that would steal our lunch from our lunchboxes. True story. Yeah. My cousin and I walking, and actually we lost our lunchbox to a monkey that jumped off from a tree, and warthogs that we had to avoid and stuff like that. And again, this is on the outskirts of Nairobi City, so really quite paradoxical. On the one hand, I'm seeing the city coming up, and then I'm having this very sort of out of Africa experience. Really the film captures my childhood in many ways. So to this day, when I look at this, I would rather be out there, to be honest. The whole time we've been here, I've been thinking, why can't we just take this out there? I see an extended relationship with plants, trees, animals, all of us. So to me, that's not inanimate, it's really alive. The same way we're all living and breathing in this particular room. So this began my understanding. My childhood began my understanding of the concept of interconnectedness, this indigenous principle that we've all been talking about, which is really at the heart of indigenous African thinking or African consciousness. And there's a very good book called The African Unconscious by Edward Bynum. He's an African-American psychologist, and he writes very much about this double, triple consciousness that people of African descent struggle with or grapple with or manage. And this is the idea that somehow we all have within us this African DNA, right? We can all agree that we descended from some ancestor on the Rift Valley, where at the beginning I said would be a nice place for you to visit in Kenya at some point. So if we all descended from there, or at least we can trace our genealogy from there, then there is that original consciousness that sort of sits in all of us and has dispersed over time through different civilizations and cultures. And therefore we're a community, right? And a person is a person through other persons, and all the relations within the community, including animals, trees, as I said, the moon, the stars, the sun, and so on. So I'll begin this talk by going through, by actually beginning with Amy's. Is Amy here? She's not here. Oh, no. Yeah. Oh, this is a little ode to Amy. So Amy asked a question at the beginning, what would be a framework of ethics that are African by conception, that center the life force of all living beings, that could be, in a sense, a way to humanize these artificial intelligent systems. And by humanizing, I don't mean to center the human being at the circle of life, but rather to give agency to human agents that are interacting with artificial intelligence. And AI systems, in my understanding, and I think we've had this conversation with Hussein over there, is nothing more than a mirror of what we are supposedly, right? So we're mirroring ourselves through this thing that we've fed in with our knowledge, right? And by the way, that does not include, we're speaking on behalf of trees and plants and animals and all of that, right? Their perspective is not necessarily what's presented in artificial intelligence. It's human perspective of the world, which is really interesting to me as well. So is artificial intelligence really, is knowledge artificial or not? This is a philosophical question that we can all ask. At this point, I would also like to state my position of my understanding of what artificial intelligence is and isn't. So AI is nothing more than an expression of our perception, and it's what we have perceived of the world, like I just said. But it isn't necessarily accurate, definitely not true. And it's merely human imagination at best, and not necessarily the best of our collective imagination. AI is a tool that I would like to stress that, like all other tools before it, we must begin to think of it in temporary terms. It's just a temporary tool. We've had many tools before. We've invented so many tools before. So here we are with this new tool that we've invented. But it's not a permanent thing. Others will come. We'll lose our cell phones. Our mobile phones will disappear. We might have chips in our heads. I don't know. When that time comes, that's what it is, right? And from that lens, we can begin perhaps to preoccupy ourselves with its temporary function, which is potentially, or at least that's what I would imagine a lot of the tech types in Silicon Valley were called or felt compelled to do, was to help us solve what we're referring to as a polycrisis through technology. That's a myriad of problems that are human engineered and therefore artificial problems too, such as racial injustices, border wars, social inequalities, food insecurity, and so on. These are problems that we have invented. These are artificial problems. We know that we can solve them instantly, right? I think there was a time at which, was it Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk asked, how much is the World Food, the WFP program, the World Food Program budget for solving hunger in the world? And I think that conversation was kind of swept under the rug very quickly, because that would have meant, let's solve hunger today, and I've got the billions for your budget, and that didn't happen. So we know that there are other players in that game of false food insecurity. So these are all artificial problems which can be resolved using artificial intelligence. And now I think that my notes are mixed up. No, there. So in a way, what I want to challenge is that AI is already functioning as a collective. It's a collective in the sense that it's a collection of different knowledge systems. So I'm going to be talking about Ubuntu, and Ubuntu, of course, is a collective mindset, which is how I'm going to present it here. of this African consciousness. But if we look at how artificial AI systems function, they function as, the AI does not function as one source of intelligence. It's reading from different ideas, different backgrounds, different knowledge systems that have been fed into the machine. Whether or not it includes all systems, all cultures, it's there anyway. Now, if we're going to look at AI from that position of a new tool in our toolkit, we must concern ourselves with teaching each other how to use this new toolkit, not as a weapon, but as something actually useful. And that's where the ethics or values or moral considerations come in. So cue in Ubuntu AI, which is Ubuntu African Intelligence for artificial intelligence. So my research on Ubuntu is influenced by the work of the late Professor Mbiti. And I know we've had a few run-ins with a few people that doubt his thinking on Ubuntu, because it was very much situated in the East African mentality. Ubuntu, Utu, Mundu, Mundu, Umuntu. There's many variations of this particular word, Ubuntu. And also the late Professor Wangari Maathai, who was mentioned here before, the late Professor Misere Mugo, who's a prolific writer on the African thinking. I think she was a professor at Syracuse University. She's now not with us anymore. Late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who obviously popularized the term Ubuntu. And also the late scholar Chinua Achebe, who I'm very fond of, and his articles on being a British protected child, that idea of what it means to be educated in a British way, so culturally educated, to be an English scholar, and at the same time be a very traditional African citizen, right? And I resonate with that because I received both as well as a child growing up. So I guess you can see that I'm trying to complete the collective work of many African ancestors who are no longer here with us, who were, to me, embodiments of Ubuntu in practice. And throughout my presentation, I'll be talking about Ubuntu as a placeholder for this idea of African consciousness. And so, because I know I talk too much or I tell too many stories, I'll just go on with the next slide. Hold on a second. Slide number 2. Yeah, there we are. So I'll begin the presentation by stating the obvious. Artificial intelligence is nothing more than data. And data is a sum of stories that have been collected over thousands of years, conversations that have been compressed and picked from online forums, and everything ever written, really, or recorded by humanity until now. Everything, all our stories, all our thinking, all our conversations, all the things that we've done up until now that have been fed into machine. I recently read an article referencing Ubuntu in this AI age by stating that I am datafied because we are datafied. Has anybody come across this here? It's a really interesting way of looking at what Ubuntu really is and how it presents itself in this age of artificial intelligence. And I think it was Samuel who mentioned here earlier in his presentation that there is no such thing as individual stories or an individual experience or a single story in Africa, right? You're not a single story, you're a collective. And I think that's true for all of us anyway. We are a sum of many stories. Meaning that my story is a sum of all our stories. And so AI cannot really distinguish whose data is whose. It simply crawls the internet and collects from multiple sources of data and feeds back to us answers based on collective data. So in a way, already AI, like I said, is functioning as a collective. But we must remember that all these stories that have been fed into AI systems are mental and social constructions of human beings. They're not the reality nor the whole picture. So we have shifting landscapes of mental realities. Like I said earlier, for instance, birds and bees and the trees and the oceans have not constructed knowledge on behalf of us and fed it into some system that we don't know about, right? But we have done that. And yet we are sort of the interface between AI systems and the rest of the living world. Additionally, as Melanie mentioned, not all human beings have fed their stories into AI systems. So not all our knowledge systems are there. And yet somehow that is a representation of us. So there's a lot of representation, misrepresentation, underrepresentation, overrepresentation of some communities, cultures, nations, gender, and so on. So we're at an interesting moment where the polycrisis is a shift of landscapes of mental realities. How we as human beings perceive of this crisis is not the same way that birds and bees and other species perceive of the crisis that we're having, right? If you were to commune with a bird or a tree or a fish or whatever, they're not aware of this crisis that we're talking about, but we are, right? So here I'm reminded, but then there is a sense of urgency in terms of ourselves as human beings and agents of creation, part of creation. Our consciousness has risen to the extent that we know that we somehow can alter creation or we can be part of creation. So I'm reminded of a quote that I came across recently by Stephen Jay Gould, who's an American paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and science historian, who is quoted as saying, "We have become, by the power of a glorious evolutionary accident called intelligence, the stewards of life's continuity on Earth. We did not ask for this role, but we cannot abjure it." Yeah? We may not be suited for it, but here we are. Here we are, with all our different mental realities. We are tasked somehow with creating a perception of what is real and what isn't. And this goes on along the lines of what the late Wangari Maathai, Kenyan environmentalist and first African female Nobel Prize winner, once said, "Culture is coded wisdom." And also, she said, "There's no escaping the fact that each one of us inhabit a planet with 7 billion other human beings, or 8 billion now. So there's no escaping the fact, you can run away from your family, but you run into another family, right? You can run away from your spouse, you run into something else, right? You can cut ties with your friends, but you'll have to make new friends. So here, the reference here is very much tapping into that Ubuntu consciousness, that we are relational. We are really relationships. We are a product of relationships. So how have these shifting landscapes of mental and socially constructed realities affected the design of AI systems and the input of data that is meant to represent who we are? It all began with social media. Or one could say, in fact, that it began long before social media, but that social media accelerated the process by hacking human attention. Attention, as we know, affects how one responds to emotions and therefore how one makes decisions based on how one feels. So I'll quote a small passage in an article that appeared in The Guardian recently, written by Johan Hari, a journalist who went around interviewing the world's leading psychologists on attention and its rapid decline since the onset of social media. And he references a small study that was conducted on college students, which found that students now focus on any one task for 65 seconds. That's it. Okay. A different study of office workers found that they only focus on average for 3 minutes. That's less on Zoom calls, by the way. I'm guilty of that. I don't think I pay attention on Zoom at all. And all of this isn't happening because we're all individually being weak-willed or infected with a new form of attention deficit disorder. Your attention span did not collapse. It was hacked, stolen. How many of you are still here with me? Good one, hey? So if social media stole our attention, guess what AI is about to steal? Your intimacy. And I'm not talking about the kind of intimacy that is experienced in romantic experiences only. I'm talking about the connection that builds strong relationships. On social media, we're all friends or foes. And in real life on the streets, we're strangers at best and quite awkward at even sharing the strangeness of our superficially constructed social networks. We don't talk about our social networks when we meet in person, but yet we're very much active on social media. It's really an interesting thing that we do. So some advancements have already been made with AI now capable of simulating human emotions and responses through virtual companions and chatbots and all the rest of it. In short, there's no way of telling whether or not you're really interacting with a bot or a real human. And quite frankly, when I'm trying to rebook a flight or claim a lost baggage or whatever, I don't really care whether I'm talking to a chatbot or a real human. I just want my bag. I just want my flight ticket or whatever it is, right? So we're there. And that's the problem. Care for one another is what helped our species survive. There's a lot of literature on care as sort of the embodiment of this human consciousness. Yeah, we care, therefore we are together. We look after each other. So care is central to the principles of Ubuntu. Our collective ancestors, all of us, our collective ancestors in Africa, survived in tribes and then later in large numbers of nations because they cared. And I don't mean care in terms of the romantic feelings of caring of someone, but actually really practical caring of each other. Understanding that my survival is dependent on yours. So collectively, we have to care for each other, whether we like each other or not, right? So, and I'm also not going to romanticize these tribal Africans who lived back then. Yes, they fought wars, they battled for resources, just like we're doing. And they are just as guilty of the myriad of social inequalities that we now face. But central to the concept of personhood was care for community. They weren't going to completely destroy each other and there was not this idea of, I am going to be left alone. I'm going to survive on my own. There was survival of the fittest, but the survival was survival of the fittest community in a sense, yeah? So if we rapidly lose the ability to care, will AI assume that role on our behalf? And will it even know that we have this as an essential part of being human? So for example, do I want an AI nanny's voice as a fast recognizable voice that my baby relies on to soothe them in the middle of the night? Now, I'm not going to be having any more children. I have 4, but my children might have children and therefore I'll have grandchildren. I would rather be the first voice that my grandchildren hear, to be honest, and not an AI bot. I actually watched a film recently called Pod Generation. Has anyone seen that? On the plane, I think maybe it's one of those in-flight entertainment pieces. And it was around removing this responsibility for the womb and having an artificial womb in an egg that then both partners can share the nurturing of the unborn child all the way up to, from conception to birth and beyond. And at first I thought, well, this is too much for me. But then as I got into it, it really got inside my head and I kept asking myself these questions. I'm like, maybe I would have actually been okay with that myself, you know, having had 4 kids. Maybe by number 2 or number 3, I would have been like, okay, that's it. Let's have the artificial womb. That's a good idea. But then they got me at the point where the pod had to be, there was a tension between the business owners of this pod space and the partners. And that decision became, the decision of where the child would be born was no longer a human decision. It was a corporate decision. And I found that to be very strange. So maybe that's where we're going. That we will be like dolphins, you know, taking care of our eggs outside of ourselves. And whether or not this empowers women to have ownership of their bodies is a question that we will be asking ourselves, or AI will be trying to learn from us. And does it empower men to have a more active role in nurturing their unborn infant? I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but this is really interesting to me for those of you who are interested in the fem work and all of that. And what does it do for the infant? Is the infant considered a human baby or an artificially generated child? I don't know what that means for the child. What does this technology, in fact, if it would become a reality, do to our sense of being human? Do we call ourselves human? And what does that even mean? What would be the definition? So that's where Ubuntu comes in. We're now facing the greatest question of all. What does it mean to be human? Now, many philosophers that have been mentioned here before, and civilizations in the past have attempted to answer the same question, but none have come so close as not only elaborating it, but actually embodying it physically, mentally, and emotionally, the human being form, as the Bantu speakers across Africa. And when I talk about the Bantu, it's a whole language group. But this idea of Ubuntu, I will repeat again, is a placeholder for African consciousness or African intelligence on personhood or being human. So the Bantu have kept that word alive all the way down to South Africa. It's a Zulu word, Ubuntu, but it can be found in other parts of Africa. In my home country, we say Omondo. My Kikuyu language is Modo. And then in Swahili is Utu. So there's a lot of different variations linguistically of the word Ubuntu. So it may be originally from the Zulu and Shona tribes of Southern Africa, but again, like I said, it's traveled and can be traced in many other Bantu speaking languages across Africa. So Ubuntu directly translates to being human, literally. Ubuntu. Ubu is being, Ntu is human, the person. So being human. So it's actually the word for human being. And that's why, to me, it's really interesting to trace that idea of what it means to be human to an actual word that defines human being. Allow me to take a bit of a Shakespearean approach, a poetic approach, and ask the philosophical question of what it means to be human, to be or not to be human. That is the question. And apparently we now have choices and many forms of becoming human, depending on who you speak to and what your desires are. So you merely need to visit a few social media platforms, which we all do. TikTok and Instagram are notorious for altering the looks and sounds of human beings. So we don't really know what it means to be human, but we can attempt. Now here are a few expressions that attempt to define what being human is from the Ubuntu perspective. And this is in contrast to the idea of Ubuntu is often presented in short statements called maxims. And so, for example, a person is a person through other persons, which is the most popular one, which is really in contrast to the idea of Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am. And I'm not here to disqualify or discount or argue against that positionality, but I'm here to also challenge the idea of the I in that personhood, because logic dictates, obviously, I did not turn up out of an egg, right? I was a product of two human beings. And then, of course, you have all these other ones. A person is, they all say the same thing. Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabantu, Motho, Kemotho, Kabotho, Diri Nekuritiri, that's Shona. I am because we are. That's also one of the more famous ones. So it goes on. And I think if you go through various proverbs in African languages, you will find a variation of this idea, this concept of personhood, this idea of I am a product, I am plural, I am not just myself. I'm a product of relationships. So Beatty is the one who challenged Descartes' position of I think, therefore I am. And he said, I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. That was a statement that he made. I agree with that positionality because I believe, as an artist as well, I also write children's books. Ideas are, after all, not original or unique to any one human being. I develop my writing by talking to other writers and thinking about storytelling from different ways. And actually, if you look at the way that African oral storytelling is constructed, there's never really a final story. It is a story meant to be passed down to another. So the original storyteller is never really known. So we borrow from each other consciously or subconsciously. Therefore, thinking, quite like machine learning, is a collective effort. So what can we learn from Ubuntu ethics, and how and why should we consider these definitions of human being as relevant in answering the question today of what it means to be human? If AI is a mirror of humanity's values and ideas of our collective coexistence, then AI needs a set of ethics. Now, I use this word ethics very loosely. We were having a conversation with my dear sister here, and we were talking about the word ethics. And I don't actually have a word for ethics in my Kikuyu language, but I have the word for protocol. And I think that's the closest that it comes to. There's a systematic way of doing things, of being, of sitting in a circle of elders, of being with your mother, of being with your sister, of being in a particular place in the home, as a lastborn, as a firstborn, and all this. There's a lot of protocol. It's nuanced, it's unspoken, but you understand it, and you can see it through the embodiment of others around you. So If AI is a mirror of humanity's values and ideas of our collective coexistence, then AI needs a set of ethics or protocols that clearly define what being human really is. And if we're going to go with that, we don't have a choice but to look back to the original conception of human being, which is Ubuntu, being human. I've looked around, and Ubuntu appears to be the oldest available word that directly translates to human being. As I said, split into two parts. Ubu means being, and Tu means human. Sometimes the word person is used interchangeably with human. So Ubuntu directly means being human, which suggests that it is a process of becoming rather than a static state of being. Ubuntu, therefore, is a verb by definition, made active by the process of becoming. So you activate your Ubuntu at some point, and I'll go to that in the next slides. So by Ubuntu ethics, a person who engages in this process of becoming human can be identified by the way that they communicate. And this is where Desmond Tutu talked a lot about nonviolent communication, right? So that's a very big part of a person with activated Ubuntu, nonviolence, how you communicate. Are your words invoking violence? Therefore, is there violence within you that you need to work through? Or are your words invoking peace around you? A person who's Ubuntu is identified by their demeanor, which exudes peacefulness, calmness, and contentment. Ubuntu correlates with holism, the process by which growth occurs holistically. Okay? Holism sees all phenomena as an emergent evolutionary process, meaning that humanity, for instance, is embedded not only in society, but also in the depth of the natural world. The saying, "I am because we are," which is often how Ubuntu is explained, can also be argued to mean that the human being becomes aware of their place in the natural world. The we in "I am because we are" is also inclusive of the rain that's falling, the trees, the leaves, all other life forms. Although to be human begins with identifying yourself with other human beings. I'll explain how we becomes both human and non-human entities in another slide. So from a holistic perspective, ideally the concept of Ubuntu perceives humanity as being embedded in society as well as in the natural world. Therefore, Ubuntu and holism challenges humanity to reconsider who we are as a human species and who we are wanting to become from this point on. And now in the face of new non-human intelligence, which we're calling artificial intelligence. So in designing AI systems, the question that arises is what values or ethics or protocols present our collective thinking? If AI is a mirror of ourselves, what values and ethics does it mirror back to us? So here are the 5 principles identified by various scholars, but I particularly use J.S. Mbiti's framework of Ubuntu principles, and Biggie as well. It begins with when a child is born, their ability to develop their emotional intelligence through survival skills. So this sort of idea that African villages, children run loose and do whatever they want to do and nobody's really kind of watching them. There is a social understanding, particularly if you observe the women, they're always somewhere around. They're not hovering. Okay, we don't have the helicopter parenting or the curling parent or the panda mom and all of those other tropes that we assign modern women. What we have, or what there is, or what existed, or at least how I grew up, was I grew up with grandmothers. I would be sent to the village to be with my grandmothers during the school holidays. And I spent most of that time alone or with cousins or whoever, just doing whatever you need to do in the forest or in the gardens where they were planting and harvesting. But the grandmothers only came when there was either a problem that you couldn't resolve, or they showed up when you were in danger. but they really generally stayed out of your space so you could develop these survival skills. Okay, we had to escape all kinds of things. I remember my cousin being bitten by a snake and all of us trying to work out whether it was a poisonous snake or not, and then calling the adults to come and help and turning out that it isn't. So you learn these things by experience. So our experience was not taken away from us. We were not given a manual of how to be, climb that tree that high, fall that low, do this. There was not any of that, right? And that doesn't mean that we were not looked after. I never had this sense of being left alone or not cared for. In fact, there was a sense of freedom from having this division between the adult world and the children's world. And that's what survival really means. But then from there, you're meant to move on to understand. Once you really understand how to survive, like really your five senses, you then become a regulated person, right? So a person who can regulate their impulses. And once that regulation happens, which is now what we call emotional intelligence, right? You begin to understand that you cannot exist independent of others. So solidarity becomes an important part of these principles of Ubuntu, where you then form bonds of solidarity with others. So relationships begin after you've identified who you are in the entire space, right? Not just within the family, but who you really are once you become consciously aware of yourself as a walking being and being in relationship with the world. So solidarity, that those bonds of solidarity begin to form once you realize that I must be kind to my friends, I must share with my friends, I must respect my friends. And then respect comes after once you form these relationships. It's really difficult to explain respect because sometimes we think we teach our children, respect the elders, respect everyone. But it doesn't begin from nowhere. It's not a command. It's an understanding of the relationship that you have between yourself and the elder, or between yourself and your peers. And so there are forms of respect that you give to different people in society. And then from respect, once you have that respectful relationship with different groups of people, you become a compassionate being. You're compassionate to those with whom you're in relationship. But because you have stretched this muscle of respect and relationship building, it is quite easy to be compassionate to everyone, right? Because you are good at creating bonds of solidarity. It isn't something you hesitate. You know that you must be in relationship with others. And then dignity. Dignity is a very it's kind of the end goal of Ubuntu. A person with Ubuntu is a dignified member of society. And by dignity, I mean that you hold life in a sacred form, right? It's not just dignity towards other human beings, but it's actually dignity to all life forms. So I think I heard someone here talking about how cutting down a tree requires ceremony and all of that. I remember, I'll tell a little story. So my grandmother lived not far from where we are, where I grew up. And so we would walk to her house. And between my grandmother's house and our house was a big, enormous, I think it was I'm forgetting what kind of tree it was. Huge, big, enormous tree in between our home and my grandmother's home. And there was a conflict between my dad and his brother over land. Land issues are a big problem in Kenya. And my uncle, years later, because of this conflict between him and my father, went and cut down this tree. And anything else was okay. We were tolerating all the drama and all of that, but the cutting down of the tree had a different sensation. It was like a sin. And to this day, we still talk about that tree that was cut down. That tree meant so much to everyone. I mean, it gives me goosebumps when I think about it. So dignifying, that was like the act of dehumanizing himself by cutting down that tree. So we all understood that tree had a life beyond just being a tree. It covered all the base. It was our collective thinking, and stories were told under that tree. We met under the tree. We hid around the tree. We played around that tree and all of that. And I think beyond that, we understood that the tree had something to do with the environment around us. Even though we didn't understand it biologically, environmentally, but we understood that tree had a purpose. So that's Ubuntu values. Ubuntu in action. So I work at the New Institute with, I've got 5 minutes. Jeez Louise. Okay, I'll finish up quickly. Ubuntu in action. One of my colleagues at the New Institute is a Tibetan Buddhist, and he's also the head of the Bhutan Center for Bhutan Studies. He's also the main author of the Bhutan Gross National Happiness Index. And we worked out that these 5 principles of Ubuntu actually correlate with the wisdoms of Tibetan Buddhism. So survival can be looked at as cultivating emotional intelligence, which is considered the wisdom of all wisdoms from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective. Solidarity is the perfecting of the practice of relationships. Respect is mirroring as a measure of equality. So you mirror each other, and by mirroring, you form that equality. We are equal, right? Compassion is reciprocity in action, right? So you move beyond empathy to actually activating the act of caring for each other. And then dignity, as I said, is reflecting on interconnectedness, which by another scholar and a dear friend of mine calls this inochi, which is a Japanese catch-all phrase for life. Yeah. So we need an intentional approach to humanizing AI systems. And why is that? AI housekeeping, that's what I'll call it. We need a housekeeping, a code of conduct for being on these platforms in this space that we're building, which will help us moderate our culture, our content, many worldviews, as Melanie mentioned, many worldviews united by shared ethical principles. Nonviolent communication is also embedded in Ubuntu principles, which we know from Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King, Wangari Maathai, Jane Goodall, and so many others talk about nonviolent communication. And intelligent flourishing. I borrow from my friends of the Navajo Nation who talk about all my relations as one community of life. Peacemaking is sort of the end goal of being a person with Ubuntu. That dignified human being is actually a peacemaker. And that's a duty and responsibility of all of us, not just a right. You know, we talk about peace as right and all of that, but we have a duty and responsibility, and that's how we become peacemakers. So the who and the how, the most important person in the room in Africa is a storyteller. Therefore, the most important storyteller in AI is the artificial person, that person, whatever we define person. And we know that, again, like I said, AI is data is storytelling, and Africa is a land of stories. So if we increase storytellers in Africa and create a database of stories, and I'm so glad to talk with my dear brother Hussein, who's talking about increasing the data from Africa and pushing it into the AI systems, then we can increase AI's ability to detect these Ubuntu principles, yeah? And we might get to this point where I am referring to as collective human intelligence with collective artificial intelligence. So if we can get to that point, which is actually where we need to go, rather than think of ourselves as separate from machine, we are already there. We're intertwined, we're entangled with so much more than just AI, right? And so this would be an ideal place to get to. And then we might end up at Qi, which is a Chinese life force or soul force or energy, which I am cleverly stealing and calling it compatible hybrid intelligence. So different communities of intelligence all brought together and showcasing these principles of Ubuntu, which are universal, as you can see, even just borrowing from the Tibetan Buddhist ideas. So I end again with a Shakespearean poetic question: to be or not to be Ubuntu? That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. We have a few minutes left for Q&A. Yes, I see your first hand.
Thank you very much. Sorry. My question is on the last, but I think one of those last slides where you mentioned Gandhi and Mandela and so on. So I'm not sure, in the Ubuntu principles you you made 5 principles of where you worked with Bhutanese academic or intellectual, I'm not sure. So it doesn't fit with, in my conception, it doesn't align with Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, because in my view, Gandhi's nonviolence actually kind of perpetuated colonialism in India. That is one view. It's a critical view of Gandhian principles. And Gandhi also is seen as one of the figures who perpetuated caste-based Hindu order. Still, it continues, and it is it's embedded in the Gandhian values, which we continue to practice. So that's again another form of violence, though it is not a physical violence, but it has a different kind of violence in the society, and it doesn't fit into the values of equity, reciprocation, and justice, and these kind of values. So humanizing AI systems, if we go with Hindu values which Gandhi believed in, and not even Hindu, it's Brahmanical values, I would say. So Brahmanism is on the top. Brahman is there, the caste system. So if we are trying to align AI value ethics with a Gandhian ethics, then we are in a big trouble in India. So that's my, because it is very important in international stage. A lot of places I see Gandhi as one of the towering figure in non-violence, but in India he's very controversial figure, especially in the contemporary caste discourse, because especially post independence, Ambedkar became one of the tall figures in the equality and justice discourse. So Gandhi is relegated to the the opposite pole. So that's why it's very important to that's my comment. But at the same time, I also want to understand what is your view on why you put this
Okay.
along with all other
I have a response.
figures.
Yes, thank
my
you.
question.
I have a response. So I'm not a Gandhian scholar, but I work with people that are really big Gandhian scholars. And one of the things that fascinates me about Gandhi's life, okay, if you read his interpretation of the Gita and all these other books that he's written, he spent 21 years in South Africa. Okay, that has to account for something. And I think when you're talking about Ubuntu, we're talking about South Africa, right? At least from that perspective, right? So I think he may have established this nonviolent approach to conflict resolution from his time observing the way in which the Boer War was, how people interacted with each other during that period of time when he was in South Africa. Now, I know he's a very controversial figure in India, absolutely. And I sit on both ends. I understand both arguments. But for this particular space, I was referencing how the actual idea of nonviolent communication from an Ubuntu perspective, not from the way that Gandhi interpreted it for Indians, right? That's a different conversation that we can have on the side. So I think that Gandhi had his own interpretation of nonviolence, and whether or not it was understood the way that he meant for it, I don't know. I cannot speak on behalf of billions of people in India, but I completely understand your hesitation. But there are two sides to this story, right? There are two camps. There's Camp Gandhi, and there's, if you go to Ahmedabad, that's Gandhi land. And if you go to the rest of India, non-Gandhi land, right? So I understand this positionality, but I think we can look at the idea of non-violent communication from an Ubuntu perspective, and I think that was what Gandhi was referring to, how it manifested itself in India, and how he used that maybe perhaps against the regime at the time. That's a different story, and we can look at historically what would have gone wrong. But the idea of non-violent communication is not to promote violence, right? It's to actually get towards a peaceful coexistence. That's my answer. Thank you. Yeah.
I would like to have more conversation, but
Yes, please. Let's. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. There was another question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm very new to the Ubuntu concept, so it was really informative for me. So based on that, I was wondering if you have thought about what it would look like in practice if we were to design an AI system incorporating those values, the Ubuntu values, and to what extent would those AI systems be able to address the current criticisms we know about these systems, like, for example, perpetuating these biases or encoding socio-political beliefs and those. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Thanks.
So I don't come from the technology side of things, but I do work actually currently with a technology company that's building an AI system for indigenous, like an indigenous AI system. So general indigenous knowledge put in an AI system, and my work there is to create an Ubuntu bot, so Ubuntu AI, right? So in the Credo, so when you're building a bot, right, you have to train the bot how to speak as how you want it to speak, right? So what I've done in the Credo is include a lot of those African proverbs, right? That showcase what it means to be a person, like a peaceful person, a peacemaker, or a non-violent communicator. So very much this bot will be communicating in non-violent communication, right? And speaking as a person would be speaking as a product of other persons. So looking at those values and how would you interact with a bot that is coming from that perspective? And I would hope that then, if you're interacting with such a bot, then that could help alleviate some of those problems that you're talking about. Thank you.
I think also from my perspective, I also found it a super insightful presentation. And I would actually also like to follow up on your question, because that was also on my mind. So thanks also for giving this example of an Ubuntu bot, because I feel it conceptualizes super tangibly this idea of how perspectives then shape how AI might also mirror us to an extent. And now looking at when maybe, for example, some sort of agricultural AI system would be developed, right? That is now not a chatbot, but how might you then in practice, when it's about either the data collection, maybe even a model development and a testing, how would you love to see Ubuntu values being reflected in this very kind of technical, though nonetheless super social process of developing an AI system, because that's something that's still like in my mind, how this can really materialize, because it's so rich in so many aspects.
Did you say agricultural?
Yeah, for example,
Okay.
as an example, an agricultural AI system. So how would you then love to see Ubuntu values materialize in how the system is created?
Mm-hmm. So if you look at those values, and those values are indeed, they're not unique to African societies, right? They are only unique in the sense that this is Ubuntu that I'm talking about, right? But if you look at values such as solidarity or compassion or respect or dignity, those are universal, right? So any AI system that has those as the base values would be able to replicate Ubuntu principles without calling it Ubuntu. So again, that's why I'm talking about Ubuntu as a placeholder for collective human values with origins. We have to be particular about this, right? The origins of which are an African consciousness that lives in all of us, right? So the African, again, I'm not talking about the African, Black African only, right? I'm talking about this consciousness, this African consciousness that lives in all of us. So if we tap into that, then I think we have a better chance of understanding ourselves as human beings, as a collective, if we look to principles such as these principles of Ubuntu. Yeah.
We have a last teeny tiny question and a teeny tiny answer.
Okay, do my best.
It's more of a comment than a question, but when you speak about communication, I don't know if you've seen Mugobo Ramose has this concept in Ubuntu of the Homo loquens. The human being as a speaking being.
Yeah.
So, which could be quite useful, I think, because he speaks specifically about the human beings as speaking in an Ubuntu framework, which might be interesting.
That is interesting. And also the human being is a storyteller.
Yeah,
We're the only
exactly.
species that actually tells stories.
Yeah.
So our worldview is shaped by stories that we tell. And again, that goes back to what I was saying, whether or not that is reality, it is what we have. We're a storytelling species. So how do we reconcile with that when we're building machines that now speak on our behalf? They're telling stories on our behalf. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for keeping it short.
All right. Thank you.